We're asking tonight is, are we being overly taxed? Just today, tax increases and new taxes came into effect. Levies on fuel went up by 20 cents per litre, and VAT came into effect for the first time on digital products and services sold online. Inequality is growing, and tax helps to redistribute some of the wealth to the poor. It's funding a massive social grant system in South Africa, which is keeping millions from starving. But on the other hand, the burden is carried by a small percentage of the population. Just around 6 million people pay into the fiscus out of a population of more than 50 million. And there are signs that members of the public are becoming fed up when funds from the public purse are wasted. Well, to discuss, we're now joined by Vedika Andhee from Ernst & Young. She's with me in the Joburg studio. And in Cape Town, our studio there, we're joined by Afzaal Kahn from Raft. Good evening to you both. Let me start with you, Vedika, and then we'll go to Afzaal. Looking at the figures today, the majority of our tax comes from personal income tax. So that's from individuals. About half then comes from company tax, VAT somewhere in the middle. How do we land up in this situation where individuals are bearing such a brunt?
Okay, so the first thing I guess we can look at is that the collection of personal income tax is perhaps the easiest thing to collect from SARS's perspective. That is because the employer takes on the responsibility of collecting the tax and paying it over. So from a collections perspective, one could easily meet the target that you've set out, assuming of course that people will move from band to band, and when I say band to band, I mean tax band to tax band. So yes, it is much easier to collect, and yes, a large component does come from the population of South Africa.
Let's go to Afzaal in Cape Town. Afzaal, I hope you can hear me. I just want to know what you think about the fairness of this, the burden on private income taxpayers rather than corporations.
Good evening, guys. I think the important point you raise is when we discuss are we overly taxed, that would imply some sort of comparison. And in looking at individuals, I think the important consideration is let's compare to other countries. The problem with the comparison is who do we compare to? Do we compare to first world countries like Australia and the UK? And I think at our maximum tax bracket, if you look at someone earning 500,000 Rand in a year, we're paying pretty much 50% more tax than they are in countries like Australia. Sure. I think in some of the other countries, the tax rates are a lot lower. So we definitely are a highly taxed jurisdiction.
What about France then? What about jurisdictions that are really trying to redistribute?
Well, look, it's a difficult thing when you try to redistribute, because if, you made the point that we're looking at a small tax-paying community. And if you move it from individuals, where do you move it to? You can't move it to corporates, because if you look at our tax rates on the corporate side, we sort of benchmark internationally at 28%, but there's a hidden element in that dividends tax used to be STC. And when it was STC, it was a corporate tax. So we renamed it, we called it something else, but effectively the taxes on corporate income, by the time it gets into the hands of the shareholder, is 39%. So if you compare 39% to 40%, your individuals and your corporates are actually paying the same tax. So where do you shift it to?
Okay, so looking at dividends tax as well. What do you think? Because there are two arguments. And let's stay with the top bracket, because it's very different for different people depending on what they earn.
That's good.
The first argument is they're paying too much tax. The other argument is that we can redistribute much more and tax from the rich to really help the poor.
Okay, so Francis,
Afzaal, sorry, I'm going to come back to you. Let me get Vedika
Sure.
to answer this. We'll be back with you in 1 second.
Okay, so the concept of are we being overly taxed is very subjective. That's the first thing. I think when bearing in mind that we've got petrol price increases and we've got all the other additional burdens, any payment that we need to make is a burden on us. However, if we look at, when taxes is something that is very scientifically computed. At the end of the day, what the government looks at is it looks at, so how much money do I need? What are my debts? What do I need to put into health? What do I need to put into infrastructure, etc.? It comes up with a figure and then it distributes it. So at the end of the day, the actual calculation is scientific, and therefore the distribution, you would argue, would be scientific as well. In South Africa, yes, the most taxes are collected from your higher income earners, and that is something that occurs globally. But looking at, and Afzaal mentioned, he talked about a few tax rates in Africa. If we were to look at South Africa versus everything north of the border, we're at the top 40% brackets, but the average tax rate in Africa is 29.77%. But we must realize that we're in different places, in the sense that South Africa is almost at a developed stage. Quite a few of the countries are in the developing stage. So our needs are a bit different. Our collection, our ability to collect money and enforce legislation is also different.
Afzaal, your opinion more on the philosophical side, because government does have a choice of where the tax comes from. Do you believe, I got the gist from you earlier, that we are already in a system that's redistributive?
And I'm happy that you mentioned the philosophical debate, because Vedika made an important point when she said there's a science behind this. And I think the important point is, if we highly taxed, how long have we been highly taxed for? And why are we only upset about it now? And I think Vedika made the point in that once we know how much money a country needs to spend, we then have to say, let's go collect, and where does it come from? So this R1 trillion budget, I think that the question is more, what's in that R1 trillion budget? So if it's about, we reach a point where I don't think we can tax more. We've reached a point, I don't think we can raise any other taxes. We can't really redistribute. We're at the max. The point being raised by tax professionals is on a capital gains tax, it's too high. On a wealth tax, it's too high. For the poor, it's too high. For the middle income, it's too high. So where do we go from here? The answer was, well, let's put in incentives to boost the economy. But perhaps we need to look at that R1 trillion budget and maybe be modest.
So maybe bring that down. Vedika, let me move to you, because some people say, let's just look at the tax coming in today on digital goods,
yes,
which is maybe good because foreign companies have been selling here and not being taxed. But is SARS getting desperate to find new avenues for revenue?
Okay.
Or is it just being creative, which we should applaud?
I think it's being creative, and I think we're moving in the direction of quite a few of the other more developed economies out there. We have to realize that we can collect only so much money from tax, from individuals and from corporations. So the next step is, what next? And the next step is to see what other creative methods, like digital technology as an example.
I want to look at tweets that we received today, because this is about perception. So
Yes.
we put a question out there. Are we being taxed too much? Nick says, yes, far too much. The money is wasted in places that don't need it. What about the poor people? Ruth says, we pay way too much taxing our salaries. When we buy anything, there's no relief. Sky Dave, no, we pay a fair tax. The issue is, what is our return from our taxes? Prophet says, I don't think we are paying that much, but I think the money must not be used to upgrade and Kandla. Pashi, and another thing, tax robs everyone. It's just too much. If only the government would cut costs on some unnecessary things. So let me start with you, Afzaal, in Cape Town. Do you think South Africans are starting to push back? Because the finance minister today is saying that we have great compliance, and of course, if you don't pay, SARS fines you. But people are looking closely at where their tax money is going as well.
Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The fact that we have an efficient revenue service is a feather in our cap as a country. We get better credit ratings, we can go and raise bonds internationally. So the work done by the Revenue Authority, I think, is quite good. Yes, they are aggressive, and I think there are measures in place now, like the Administrative Justice Act, to deal with those types of aggression. But from a taxing perspective, I think what they're doing is correct. Interestingly, you mentioned the point about the new e-commerce tax that's coming in. I think that's just a fact of globalization. As we sit, and I don't know how many of your kids out there play Clash of Clans, you're basically paying a company sitting in America, but you're paying them sitting in your home from your credit card. Shouldn't they be paying VAT? So I think that's just, as the game changes, I think you're still spending your money, you're just not spending it globally. So that's the added dynamic.
All right, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to let you go, Afzaal Kahn from Raft in Cape Town. Vedika, final word from you on these perceptions. Do we have any way to gauge how South Africans feel right now about paying taxes?
Well, you know, when it comes to taxes, the key thing is that the moment that there's a scandal, people want to know where their money goes to. I want to know where my money goes to. And yes, we've got these little, the projects that are set out by government, which then feed into, so how much taxes do we need to actually fund all of these expenses? But people will start questioning the amount of taxes they pay and whether it is fair the moment that there is a scandal. So is my money going into where it is supposed to go? And that every citizen has the right to ask. However, from a tax perspective, if we look at it, government has been trying to cut down on things like corruption, trying to cut down. We talked, I mean, there was an excerpt earlier on about the flights that are given. Now, earlier on last year, there was an announcement that no longer will ministers fly first class. They will be moved down to business class. And also there will be a reduction on the number of flights, or the number of people that will be allowed to go to certain areas. So the government recognizes that it needs to cut down on costs. However, consumers and rather taxpayers also have the right to go, okay, you've told me this. Now, explain to me why my money is going to certain areas.
That principle of modesty that the Finance Minister spoke about today. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Vedika, Andhee from Ernst & Young.